All right, 131 folks, let's talk about this again. I got to tell you, my computer's acting up this morning, so you just missed an excellent 8.5 minute video on the Unit 3, the other half of Chapter 6, but I'll try to revise what I said. What I was talking about is the transitions. We talked about creating the Constitution. We talked about creating the bicameral legislature. We also talked about the Constitution itself is not sufficient, that it needs some provisos, it needs some correction. That's where the Bill of Rights come in. And the Bill of Rights is huge because it's the first 10 amendments, but it's also an ongoing argument. It's an ongoing argument between two factions, the Federalists, which are going to be led by Alexander Hamilton, and the Anti-Federalists, who are going to be led by Jefferson. And they're going to argue about which division of the government should have the more power, whether it should be the national government, the federal, whether it should be states and states' rights, and whether or not they should be sovereign. This is going to compromise with the Bill of Rights, and so it's kind of huge with what's going on at this point. It's a big part, but you also end up with these two factions, the Hamiltonians against the Jeffersonians, and they're going to slug it out because they're both going to be in Washington's government, and they're both going to represent two different factions. When it comes to Jefferson, he's a strict constitutionalist. He says, listen, this is what the Constitution says, so this is what we can do and should do. And it comes to Hamilton, and he is not. Okay? Within the Constitution, within the Bill of Rights, there are implied powers and reserved powers. You got to know those terms, so look them up. Implied powers and reserved powers. Reserved powers are those powers that are not delineated, not mentioned anywhere else in the Constitution as given to the federal government, so therefore they're reserved to the states. All right, reserved to the states. And then there's implied powers, and the implied powers are things that are not listed in the Constitution, but because it says we need to do A, B, and C, that means we also need to be able to do D. All right. If we have a judicial system, if we have a series of laws, that if their job to decide whether the laws are indeed constitutional, if there is an implied judicial system, then we need to be able to create judges. We need to be able to create courts. And so that's part of that implied set of powers. And so what we look at is an ongoing argument between strict constitutionalists and some that are a little bit more loose in interpretation. What happens is this: Jefferson and Hamilton are both in Washington's cabinet, and Hamilton is going to be in charge of the new treasury. So what he wants to do is he wants to take a page from Adam Smith's book, The Wealth of Nations. And yeah, I know the title's longer than that, but that's what we're going to go with. He wants to talk about free enterprise. He wants to talk about capitalism. He wants to create a series of economic reforms. He's going to write a text called Report on Public Credit, and it's going to be this. He's going to outline a plan for the United States to create a federal government, not government, but federal treasury, to assume a debt from the states that's left over from the Revolutionary War, to create a tax system, a lien system, import and customs taxes, in order to finance this federal government. This is going to fly in the face of Jefferson. What you have to do is go back a page or two and look, because when it came to the Bill of Rights, the Bill of Rights has a rather important set of documents called the Federalist Papers. And the Federalist Papers are about the ongoing argument about which should be more powerful. And it's going to set some really important opinions out there. And it outlines the argument between Jefferson and Hamilton. What we end up with is going to be the Compromise of 1790. If you've ever wondered why Washington, D.C. is right there on the edge of Southern Territory and on the edge of Northern Territory, why it's located in what's equivalent to the edge of Maryland, it's because of this Compromise of 1790. The South, more or less, gets the capital. Okay, it's close to the South. It's close to the heart. It's close to where they can affect it on a daily basis. And the North, or Hamilton and Company, get this national bank. They get this national system of credit. They create what is a national debt because, based on what Alexander Hamilton has put out there, based on what Adam Smith has said, this is a way of giving our economy street rep. It's a way of giving us credit as a nation, because now we have a bank, now we have a funding, now we have all this stuff. And so what we go into is we go into a full-blown nation. It goes okay. Not good, not bad. It goes okay. We're going to run into some hiccups. We're going to look at Bacon's rebellion. Washington is literally going to have to send out the army to quell a rebellion within the confines of the United States. It doesn't happen very often, but we do occasionally have to do that, and this is when he does it. What we are also looking at is we're looking at interaction. We're looking at interaction with foreign powers. Washington is walking a fine line. Our Secretary of State, Jefferson, is walking a fine line. We're trying to set up some treaties without being involved in any other wars. But while we're doing this, we're also dealing with our own problems. The book mentions the Battle of Fallen Timbers. It talks about the Whiskey Rebellion. It talks about creating some issues. What's going to happen is we're going to push westward. We're going to create some inroads into the west to try to expand our territory as far as our holdings go, but we're going to start bumping into what is left of both France and Great Britain, that both have holdings in the continental North America at this particular point. So what happens is this: we know that Britain and France are fighting. We're going to get drawn into portions of their war. Even though we're going to try to stay at a distance, we're going to be drawn into portions of the war. So we start to look at other issues. And the other issues we start to look at is the quasi-war with France. We're going to end up fighting with France, having a war, but not quite a war. We're going to end up with the XYZ affair, which I think is interesting. What happens in our attempts to stay out of the war, we're going to create the basis for a new war. The book talks about Alien Sedition Acts of 1798, talks about Naturalization Acts, and the problem is, in our attempt to stay neutral, we're going to, kind of have to fence more or less, as in fencing, not as in building a wall, but as in fencing, as in kind of creating a sparring match with Britain, create a sparring match with France to keep them at a distance, but also to keep the temperament of citizens here that are friendly. Jefferson is a big Francophile. I mean, he loves France and wants us to side with them against Britain, and we're not going to do that. And so what we do is we see a series of acts, and these series of acts, the Naturalization Act, the Judiciary Act, all that is about setting up this new government and about working out some of the issues. One of the issues we're going to have to work out pretty quickly is a transition of power. Washington set a trend, folks. He says, listen, I served 8 years, and I think I'm good. I'm out. I want to go home now. Thanks. I want to go sit down underneath my olive trees. I want to enjoy the shade. I want to enjoy my plantation. I want to enjoy my life, and I want the heck out of Washington, D.C., even though it's not Washington, D.C. yet. What he wants is he wants to retire. He says 2 terms. 2 terms is enough for anybody to do this job. I don't want to be king, because he actually turned down the job of king. I don't want to be this person. I want another person to step up. And so this idea of a transition of power, a smooth transition of power, which is highly unusual, is something he's going to set up. And so we're going to end up with our very first, not election, but a smooth transition of power due to this election that's coming up. And we're going to find out that these factions we were talking about before are going to rise. So take a look at it and see what you think, and see how we're setting a trend for transition of power that still relatively holds up these days. All right, thank you.